Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ryan Burrows, and I'm the Executive Director of the American Kratom Association. We're also joined by Mac Haddo, our Senior Fellow on Public Policy. Our purpose for this meeting tonight is to give you the latest on where we stand with the Federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act, as well as an update on the activity at the state level. Before I turn it over to Mac, with so much activity with our efforts to pass the KCPA, as well as fight bans, we simply need your help. I'm asking all of you to please reach out to your network of advocates, and if they have not volunteered to be an American Kratom protector, now is the time. This was most recently evident in Atlanta on Monday. We fought a potential ban and had a great turnout. But life happens, and you have to go back to work and pick up your kids from school. We certainly understand that. But all of a sudden, we were left with very few advocates that were able to stay and tell their story. If we can continue to build our advocacy base, we will be certain to be well represented at these hearings in the future. Thank you again for joining us. We will have the Q&A on during the session, and I will now turn it over to Mac.
Thank you, Ryan. And let me first start out by reiterating what Ryan just said of how important it is that we re-energize in order to get the Kratom community speaking out loudly. The most effective advocacy grassroots effort that I have ever seen occurred in 2016 when the Kratom community united in order to fight the proposed ban that was published in the Federal Register at the end of August in 2016. And within 30 days, that ban would have taken effect on a temporary basis for 2 years, but would have, of course, set the stage for a permanent ban on Kratom. And it was the magnificent response, coupled with efforts by retailers that were motivating people, alerting them, educating them. And now we're, 6 years later, 7 years later, and we're finding that there is, and it's understandable, fatigue within the advocacy community. But now we've got to redouble our efforts. And I'll give you the best example of what happened there in Georgia. What you saw was a travesty because you had a chairman of the committee who obviously had spoken with and coordinated with the attorneys that were leading that effort. No fewer than 4 attorneys spoke about this legislation. And the only reason that they're promoting a ban on Kratom to replace the Kratom Consumer Protection Act in Georgia is that they want to be able to go down the street to the courthouse in their litigation where they want to say to the judge, well, see, even the Georgia House of Representatives and Senate agrees with us, they banned Kratom. And here's the good part for them. They will say and do anything in order to get that ban. And I'll give you an example that while there were multiple occasions when the lead attorney actually lied consistently throughout his testimony, he, for example, said that in trying to explain to the committee why nothing has happened at the federal level, he said, well, they hired Paul Pelosi Jr., he went to the FDA and that stopped it cold. That's literally what he said. Now, how in the world does that explain that in August of 2016, the FDA was asking for a complete ban on Kratom using the emergency powers of the Controlled Substances Act? How does it explain that after the DEA rejected that they pulled a second recommendation that went with the full 8-factor analysis for a permanent ban, and that was rejected in 2018 by the U.S. House, by the United States Department of Health and Human Services, Assistant Secretary Jawad withdrew it with a scathing rebuke about the FDA's disappointingly and embarrassingly poor evidence and data. And then in 2021, as you all know, it went to the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence at the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs at a lesser standard for scheduling, knowing that if it were scheduled there, we had a treaty obligation to pursue scheduling of Kratom in the United States. And even at that lesser standard, we had a 12 unanimous vote of experts from around the globe in substance abuse and addiction said that Kratom did not meet the criteria for scheduling. And yet that attorney sat there with a straight face and boldly told those legislators that, the only reason that Kratom wasn't scheduled at a federal level is because Paul Pelosi went to the FDA. Now, I'm personally not familiar with Mr. Pelosi. I've never met him, never talked to him. He was on with the AK for a short period of time prior to my joining in the lobbying effort. But I can tell you the FDA is anything but having been restrained or held back. They're doing everything they can to get in the way and obviously to promote a ban on Kratom in the United States. That is just one example of multiple lies. And I don't use that word lightly. They were lies that attorney told. illustrating the point that I hope everyone understands. They will say and do anything in order to mislead people, in order to get the objective that they want. We have got to fight back. I thank everyone who showed up because we had a strong support showing, but that hearing went on for 4 hours. That was unconscionable because all of their advocates got all of the time that they wanted, consumed the first 2.5 hours, and then they went to break. And then when we came back, they restricted our testimony to 3 minutes to start, and then it went to 2 minutes. That is just blatantly unfair. But despite all of that, I think that the message that we delivered resonated. And I'll just say one other comment. The speaker, the sponsor of the bill to ban kratom, very nice fellow, but he did not even know that there had been a Kratom Consumer Protection Act passed in 2019. In his testimony, he referenced a 2018 study bill, and he said nothing has been done since then in Georgia. It is true that in 2019, when the Georgia bill, the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, was passed, there was an effort in the Senate to take away some of the enforcement mechanisms that we recommend in terms of misdemeanor penalties for anyone who introduces a kratom product for sale in that state would suffer a financial penalty and potentially have some jail time if they ever got into the egregious situation of being caught adulterating product with a controlled substance. So this is unfortunate. It's unfortunate that there's not more integrity in the system, but in that long drawn out process, many of our advocates, as Ryan said, had to go back to their jobs or take care of getting kids at school and that kind of thing. We're going to have to continue this battle, and it won't be just in Georgia. We're going to have to fight in many other states. Many of you may have seen another travesty in West Virginia, where there's a ban bill. Senator Stewart there is passionately anti-kratom. He wants to have it banned. In the hearing, after, again, a very long period of time and going back and forth with various questions of witnesses, they finally let Jack Henningfield speak, but I didn't get to speak. And because they'd run out of time, and they said, well, we're going to come back tomorrow and we're going to finish the testimony and we'll defer it till then. As Senator Stewart watched several of the members leave under the understanding they had completed testimony, or at least they weren't going to hold a vote, and he did a head count and immediately called the anti-kratom people called for a vote on the question, which led to it passing the committee, the ban. Now, interestingly, it still has not been reported to the Senate floor. Normally that takes place the next day, and we're now into the following week and we haven't seen the report on the floor. But we're fighting hard on the House side. And when we get to a House hearing, assuming that happens, we're going to need as many West Virginia advocates as we can showing up. And that's going to be, it's going to be an onslaught of these hearings over the next month. I can tell you that that in addition to the hearings we've had this week, we have a hearing tomorrow in Richmond, Virginia, and we're going to need people to stand up. And Virginia has one of the most archaic rules about testimony. Literally, you have a chance to stand up and you can say, I'm opposed or I'm for this bill. And you might get 1 or 2 sentences out as to why. But it is important that we have advocates who are willing to come to that hearing tomorrow at 1:30 in the House Committee Room 3 in order to speak up. It's going to be a long hearing in the sense that there's a lot of bills. They don't allow a lot of testimony, but they have a lot of bills. It goes to subcommittee first and then to the committee. So those are the things that we're confronting here on a state level, and it requires digging deep, putting as much effort as you can, circulating as much information to your network of colleagues who are pro-kratom to make sure that they show up and that they're willing to tell their stories, because those stories are compelling and those legislators need to hear it, rather than some slick lawyer that wants to promote his own personal interest along the way. And many of you that watched that saw it got very personal. It got very specific on the attacks against AKA, because they're doing everything they can to discredit the grassroots advocacy effort that we're engaged in. And so we need your help. There's no question about that. Before I get to the federal legislation, let me just cover some of the great activities that are going on in the states and real encouraging signs as we go forward. All of us know that the state of Mississippi has been a difficult state. We have local action at the county levels where they're banning kratom. We have the sheriffs who are working hard against it. And we obviously had a very strong opponent who was leading the effort, who was chairman of the Drug Policy Committee, Delegate Yancey. And he was tough. When I was on a radio talk show in Mississippi, and he apparently was listening, and he texted immediately following that show that he had reconsidered and was committed to not pursuing the kratom ban out of the House. He did say that if the Senate sent him a bill, that he would try to promote it, but he recognized that the arguments, some of the arguments he characterized on our part as being compelling, and he subsequently then followed through by standing down on that, and he included our bill. Now, unfortunately, they added the tianeptine Consumer Protection Act, which is problematic in that there is no comparison between kratom and tianeptine. One is a plant in kratom, the other is a chemically derived substance, but that's what happened. The good news for us is that when this bill finally passes, they will apply to separate sections of the Code of Mississippi, and we'll deal with that. I'm not disparaging any of the consumers of tianeptine in terms of their the same problems they confront with as we confront with kratom in terms of adulteration and contamination. But I think that obviously the optics were difficult, but despite that, the bill passed. The Kratom Consumer Protection Act and the tianeptine Consumer Protection Act passed on a vote of 114-2. We expect that this will pass the Senate. We're in intense negotiations over there, working hard to get the kratom part of it through, and we're dealing with that. So that's a great turnaround for us, because we were facing a very difficult pathway with Delegate Yancey's adamant opposition to kratom, and now that's sort of softened out. We know in other banned states, for example, that Louisiana has already had a bill filed to ban kratom. We're engaging in that early. They don't start their legislative session until April, which is a very unusual start time in the legislative processes in the U.S. legislatures. We also, as all you know, we have a ban bill in South Carolina, and we're aggressively working on that, trying to find at least a compromise to make sure that we continue to have consumer access to safe, regulated kratom products. There are a couple of states that have proposed and are implementing age bills. Montana and Connecticut are two, and we don't obviously oppose that kind of thing, but we really want a full kratom consumer protection regimen so that consumers are protected from the adulteration. We have our Kratom Consumer Protection Act that's been filed, and it is currently active in Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Vermont, Ohio, Tennessee, Michigan, Minnesota, Kansas, Missouri, Texas, Colorado. I'll come back to Colorado in a minute. And I think Louisiana and Mississippi are active in that area. And the great news is that we've also got great traction in the states where we have current bans. Indiana held a hearing on kratom. We had a couple of advocates show up that turned the tide, and that was one that was not well publicized. Some of these hearings get thrown on the docket with 48 hours notice, and so we have to kind of respond as quickly as we can to that. Makes for hectic travel schedules for us, trying to be present in those areas. And then, of course, we have an ongoing effort in Wisconsin, which is going great, and in Vermont. So, and Rhode Island, the Rhode Island Consumer Protection Act is filed. The director of the Department of Health has acknowledged that kratom doesn't meet the criteria for scheduling, and so they want the KCPA to be coupled with their rescission of the ban, but they're not going to oppose us when we do that. So that's always great news for us as we go forward. And Vermont's going to follow suit. In Wisconsin, it was a very interesting process that we have over the last 7 months been engaged with the Controlled Substances Board at the behest of the legislative leaders, asking the Controlled Substances Board the question as to whether kratom meets the criteria under Wisconsin law for scheduling of dangerous substances. And of course, that those 8 factors in the Wisconsin law mirror the federal law. And so we know that they don't, because if they did, kratom would be scheduled at the federal level today, particularly with the hell-bent FDA initiative to do so. And if they had the evidence, it certainly would be today's banned. So the Controlled Substances Board went through a very deliberative process with each of the constituent groups that are members that have representatives on the Controlled Substances Board, and then they culminated that effort with a joint meeting of all a CSP meeting, and we had the great news that a study had been completed by the pharmacy students at Concordia University in Wisconsin that concluded that kratom did not meet the criteria for scheduling. So you have the best and brightest students in Wisconsin, and I would argue in the whole country, who examined all of the data and found that it was not sufficient. And then when the Controlled Substance Board held their meeting a couple of weeks ago, and they voted on in a straw poll for each one of the 8 factors, and they found that the kratom did not meet the criteria in 6 of the 8 factors. And the only 2 that they didn't find to be sufficient speak only to administrative issues about the volume of research that's available. And everyone admits that there's sufficient research now to make a decision. And the 2 factors that they cited there that were that there was sufficient evidence to move forward were really administrative ones. At the conclusion of the meeting, the outcome should have been obvious and conclusive. But an addiction recovery doctor stood up and said, "Oh no, you have to pass all 8 or you can't schedule." That is fundamentally wrong. It doesn't speak to the process that is followed at the federal or the state level. And so we recruited, with the assistance of some high-level experts in this area, 4 experts in drug scheduling at the federal level, and they have sent a letter and communicated to the Controlled Substances Board that characterization by that addiction recovery doctor, who's a member of the board, was wrong. And hopefully that will carry the day as we go forward. So that's exciting news as well. As we look at these things. In Arkansas, we've just been notified yesterday that there will be a meeting that will be held between the top legislative leaders, the Department of Health, and the governor's office about what the next steps should be in order to rescind the ban and to proceed with a consumer protection framework that would work in Arkansas. So you have this very positive momentum that's ongoing. And the headwinds we face really are about these people who claim that kratom is highly addictive. You have people who claim that extracts are bad, and you have this group of attorneys with a growing list of cases that they are soliciting actively in order to encourage people who have lost loved ones where kratom was involved or associated with the tox screen on the death, which, by the way, is not a surprise, given that we know that many people who are struggling with addictions are using kratom to get off of the more dangerous and more deadly products that they're using, whether they're legal prescription drugs or illegal illicit drugs. They're working on it, and that's why the National Institute on Drug Abuse with Dr. Volko has said that kratom is a valuable harm reduction tool. And that's what needs to be retained. But they claim these deaths just because someone on a tox screen, and it, by the way, we all know it's become very popular to list kratom if it's even present at the crime scene, which is a death scene, or if in the tox screen any kratom pops. Nobody knows, no one knows what the levels of metrogene would be to be deadly. But we do know that it's been used for millennia in Southeast Asia without a single death. And we know that here in the United States, it has been used safely. And the only reports of so-called alleged deaths related to kratom prove always to be inaccurate and misplaced and derivative of FDA job-owning medical examiners and coroners in order to list that as a cause of death if it even shows on a tox screen. You've got the NMS Labs, which is a leading toxicology forensics lab in the country that does most of the lab work for these coroners and medical examiners who are trying to create a business out of testing kratom. And so they advocate to these coroners and medical examiners to include kratom as a cause of death when actually there's no scientific evidence for them to do so. And when pressed, they kind of admit that, but they continue to cultivate their business model, which enriches them at the bottom line by expanding testing requirements, which they obviously profit from. So, you have to follow the money on these kinds of things. And of course, it's difficult to unwind this and explain it to policymakers so that they understand the bottom line on all of this. So cumulatively, all of this is an effort that we are in where we're making great progress. We're seeing a couple of danger spots that we've got to simply work on. And we're going to continue to fight on these issues and not be cowtailed by a group of aggressive lawyers. They should try the cases in the courtrooms, not in legislative hearings. I told that to the attorney, and he clapped his hands and said, "Oh, I can't wait to get you under oath." Well, I can't wait either, because anybody that's dumb enough to suggest that Paul Pelosi stopped the FDA from banning kratom doesn't understand what he's talking about, and I welcome the opportunity to go head to head with someone like that. We're always open to new science. We're open to anything that works on in order to get to a good place to protect consumers. And if there's science that documents any of this, then we're going to be able to support it, and we're going to adapt to and modify our positions if the evidence proves it. But it ought to be science, not the biases of the FDA, not the biases of law enforcement, and not the unhinged and uninformed biases of any of the people that claim that it's addictive. And the addiction recovery centers love it because they've created a new category of kratom use disorder where they can apply and get this FDA approved drugs to get people off kratom. So they take kratom, which has a mild dependency profile, and they put them on Suboxone and methadone, highly addictive and dangerous drugs, in order to replace it. It is nonsensical. So we're going to continue, as we say, to fight on that as we go forward. So that's a recap. I'll finish with the great news at the federal level. We all know that we had a bill filed at the end of the 116th Congress in December, and it had Senator Mike Lee of Utah and Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey. They are solidly and committed to refile the bill in this new Congress. We're hustling now members of Congress on the Republican side to join Congressman Pocan. So we have a bipartisan bill on the House side. It'll be refiled shortly. I would encourage everyone to email your congressman, particularly if they're Republican, and encourage them to co-sponsor the federal kratom, well, they call it the Consumer Access to Kratom bill. They absolutely should do that. I hope everyone will. So I'll conclude with that, and I'm very glad to, Ryan, to submit any questions anyone has. You're on mute, Ryan.
Thank you, Mac. If the ban passes in Louisiana, when will it take into effect?
So every state has an enactment date for legislation. I am not familiar with Louisiana specifically as to what the gap is between passage of the legislature and the enactment date following the governor's signature. I'm not thinking in terms of getting a ban bill in Louisiana. I'm thinking in terms of beating it and then making sure that we get the Kratom Consumer Protection Act passed. But there is a gap. Now, there's a legislative procedure that allows for in eminent circumstances to make it effective immediately. I don't see that happening, but that's one option that could happen. So as soon as the legislature passes the bill, the governor signs it, it could become effective immediately. But typically it's a 3 or 4 month difference between the governor's signature and enactment. But we'll check on that and be prepared to answer that question next time.
Great. Thank you for all of your work in Wisconsin. I'm curious as to what the next steps are. Will the Controlled Substances Board be able to deschedule kratom, or will a KCPA need to be filed? If so, is there any progress toward filing a KCPA?
So this is really a great example of why we need to be diligent in this. It is not, in my judgment, sufficient to simply deschedule kratom. I think that's great. It should happen. The science doesn't justify the scheduling in the first place. But we all know that the problem is that there are bad actors in the kratom space who are adulterating kratom products with dangerous substances that are highly addictive and deadly. So we want the KCPA to be passed where the states are rescinding their bans. So like in Rhode Island, where we have the KCPA that will deschedule it and enact the KCPA, the same will happen in Wisconsin. Wisconsin actually the ban was enacted by the legislature. And so they will propose the KCPA with a rescission on the ban. That's true in Indiana as well. They'll do the same thing. That was a legislative action that was taken. So in Vermont, it was actually a legislative effort as well, but it was also in combination with recommendations on some tweaks that were made to the bill by the Department of Health. So we're working with them up there as well. So this is a complicated, in some cases, but rather straightforward process of making sure that we avoid the bans, rescind the bans, but also include the Kratom Consumer Protection Act.
And will there be an email sent when you're aware of the time of the hearing in West Virginia? If not, how can we find out when it is? Are you aware of how strong the willingness is to ban it in West Virginia? Certainly, Scott, we will activate our kratom protectors in that area, and we will communicate with you and send you all of the contact information for the legislators, so you can send in your personal stories as well, and we'll provide that information so that you'll know when the hearing is, where to attend, where to meet our representation, et cetera.
And I would add to that, that as soon as we know the hearing is scheduled, we have a lobbyist on the ground in West Virginia that is hired by the AKA. They will tell us as soon as they know what the next steps are. We expect that the Senate will take up this bill at some point that's been referred by the committee, and it could lose. But if it does pass, it has to go to the House. And we've been working hard to educate the House members about what a lousy scheduling bill this is. Now, interestingly, that bill includes the various cannabinoids, Delta 8 and Delta 9, and the DEA just announced here, I think a day or so ago, that they consider those to be controlled substances under the existing statute or the controlled substance designation for cannabinoids in the federal law. That's going to change things a little bit in West Virginia in terms of what they're doing. They could still schedule those substances, but it would just be validating what the federal statute says.
And NMS Labs is the source of all of these supposed acute mitragynine toxicity deaths. What can be done to force them to either validate how they are able to come to these conclusions or to cease and desist?
Well, there's little we can do to do those things, but what we can do is educate medical examiners and coroners. And we've just concluded an authoritative paper on the way that medical examiners and coroners should deal with autopsies where kratom is detected. And we're going to start circulating that. It's now being circulated among some forensics toxicologists to get some both opinions on it. This was done by Marilyn Eustace, and the whole effort was started. Marilyn Eustace looks at every autopsy report that's done, and I challenged her to give us some guidelines. But the bigger effort that now is ongoing is that we built this paper that guides the medical examiners and concludes exactly what Marilyn says, is that medical examiners should not be checking the box and doing what the FDA wants with respect to this. A part of the education effort is really going to force NMS Labs to be accountable. They're not willing to do it now. Dr. Barry Logan, who's the vice president of their group, and I've spoken a number of times, he will privately talk, well, he understands the problem, but he's out there building a business, and by more testing gets them more revenue. And I understand that, but it shouldn't drive a public policy, nor should it mislead the loved ones of what actually caused the death. And if they want to take the convenient route of calling it a kratom associated or caused death, when the real truth is in something else, then that's wrong. And I think when you see the evidence that NIDA has concluded that these deaths are actually because of ingestion of other illicit drugs or prescription drugs causing the death, or they are in combination with a host of over-the-counter products that actually cause the death, then that should be what is recorded in these autopsies. And do not mislead these families and energize a group of trial lawyers that are just trying to exploit those families.
Okay, and then an update on Illinois.
So the bill will be filed in the House. It's already been filed on the Senate side. Senator L.G. Sims, who's the Senate leadership, and Marcus Owens, who's House leadership. We have a strong contingent of sponsors there. I'm very encouraged that we're going to do well in Illinois.
Perfect. Let's see. I'll be responding to all these questions just in an effort for time. Wanted to make sure some of these are answered. Has a lobbyist been hired for South Carolina yet?
We're in negotiations with them. It's really driven by the top level discussions with the sponsor of the bill. I talked to him for long time. He's considering switching it to the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. The outreach to him was from these families, I think instigated by these lawyers. And they're infecting this whole process. There was a lengthy letter sent to Virginia today clearly from Georgia, from these attorneys that are making all these allegations against the AKA and all of that. So that's part of our problem, but I'm hopeful that we will see a pathway in South Carolina, and then we'll decide whether we're fighting a ban or we're fighting for the KCPA, which changes our strategy in the kind of lobbyists that we hire.
Great, thank you. And any update on Tennessee?
Tennessee is a great story. We've had a very strong advocate for banning Kratom who has acknowledged directly that he's not going to pursue the ban anymore, and he's a formidable opponent, and he's going to support the KCPA. So I'm very optimistic about Tennessee as well.
Okay, and then someone had joined late, but a little more detail on Montana.
So Montana, Representative Minor has filed a bill to restrict the age limit. We're not opposed to that. We want more protections, and I've talked with him, and he's considering the KCPA to see if he'll amend the bill.
Okay. So a couple comments. How has the Georgia Kratom community responded to this proposed ban and your efforts?
So the answer to that is complicated. From my perspective, I want to pack the room. It would not have been hard to pack the room in Georgia. They had the smallest room possible, but we had a great turnout. And of course, the lawyers had turned out all of their clients, and they had contacted so-called experts, and some of those experts backfired on them. Some of them were ridiculously misinformed. But the advocacy community, I think, did okay. We need more. We need to activate people better. I'm thinking that we probably need to create a very strong Georgia Kratom Association so that we can empower advocates to have regular meetings and educational efforts with these legislators, even after we beat this ban going forward. And that probably will be the model for all of the states. This is just resource driven. We are limited in the amount of resources that we can apply to this. We're spending a ton of money on lobbyists. I spend my entire life on the road. These are things that we just have to do in order to win, and we can't be perfect, nor can we cover everything. If we could, we might even be more effective, and that's resource driven. So any increase in support you can provide to us would be great. Just as an example, Ryan went to Livingston Parish, and I think we should have a statue erected for Ryan down there because they decided not to pursue the scheduling. And that's a rare event in a local parish where the sheriff is a god, and the sheriff was against us. And somehow the council members came to the conclusion that it wasn't the right time to be scheduling Kratom. So with your help, with as much support as you can provide us, we're going to continue to do it, despite the attorneys saying, "Oh, this is this massive group that's got all kinds of money." And by the way, just another example, they made the point that that there was no research on Kratom, but that what was done has been funded by AKA. AKA has never funded a study. There was one study, the rat study, that was funded by the Center for Plant Science and Health, which we're affiliated with. And in that study, the scientists said, you cannot have any influence on the study design, nor would you see the results until they're published. Not much control there. And the results were science driven. And the way that the lawyers want to discount that is they say, oh, well, that was funded by AKA. Forget the fact that these are prominent scientists who have published hundreds of papers, and they don't want to talk about that. And more importantly, the vast majority of all Kratom research has been funded by the National Institutes on Drug Abuse. They dismiss that, they tried to obscure it, and they lie about it. So that's going to be a part of our discussion, obviously, in the appropriate venues, including the courts, to show that these attorneys will say and do anything in order to make their point, and we're just going to hold them accountable.
Great. And who from the AK is going to be in Virginia tomorrow?
I am. I'm currently flying back tonight. I'll get home about midnight, and I'll be in Richmond tomorrow, probably around 10:30 in the morning. Jack Henningfield will also be there. We have a statement by John Hinchholzer, who's the leader of has been the founder of the largest nonprofit addiction recovery center. He testified earlier. He's actually on a family event in Florida, but he's empowered me to give his statement to the committee. And so that's who will be there. And then every Kratom advocate who can show up. They will not allow you to testify other than stand at the mic and say, I support Kratom. It saved my life or helped me improve my quality of life. Whatever your story is, you need to tell it because they will allow that. And it may be that if there are too many of us, and I hope there are too many of us, then they'll ask us to raise our hands if we support the bill. So everybody who can come that lives in Virginia that can come absolutely should do so.
I believe we've gotten to the bulk of it, Mac, and I know we've got a pretty hard stop here in a couple of minutes. Do you have any final comments?
Just to understand, I think this is important for all of us to understand. We're fighting against a disinformation campaign that is completely run by the FDA and has been capitalized on by these trial attorneys that are doing one thing. They're looking to make a buck. And they want to feign how they're such a great advocate for their clients. They're in the business to make a dollar. And when they accuse us of being this high-powered money machine, they don't want to talk about the fact that they're going to collect a 40% contingency fee if they can find a deep pocket to pick. That's just the nature of the system, and I get that. So we have to fight back. We have to get as much. We have to restore the same kind of passion, the same kind of numbers that we had in 2016. Every single vendor of Kratom in this country should have a sign on their register say, sign up for the KCPA advocacy program, the Kratom Protectors. They should, because that's the way that we're going to build an army of people to fight back against this disinformation and to show up at hearings when your voices will be influential. In the Indiana hearing, there wasn't time to publicize it. They put it on the agenda 24 hours before. I scrambled to get out there, but there were two magnificent Kratom consumers that showed up. One, his assignment at school was to track what was going on in the legislature, and it popped on his screen that Kratom was going to be there. He showed up and he described how he in his life had a serious addiction problem and that Kratom saved him. The second was a social worker who described her journey and indicating that she suffered from very severe anxiety to the point that was debilitating, and that when she lived in Tennessee, she was able to go to a Kratom shop and it made her functional, and she was able to get through school, be employed, have a job, and she was employed in the state of Indiana, and she has to go back to Tennessee to buy the Kratom. These were powerful testimonies, and it moved the members of the committee. And I know that set the stage for what I think will be a good vote in Indiana. Now we're going to fight at every turn this amped up Kratom danger awareness and all these families who truly believe, and I get it, they believe. I got mocked because I called them grievers. They are grieving for their loved ones, and I cannot say a thing, nor can any of us, that will in any way, settle the issue with them. But what I can say, and I do, is that they deserve to know the truth. Sometimes the truth is painful, that a loved one may have been involved in some other activities that led to the death rather than Kratom. The truth is that they may have been taking Kratom trying to get off of more dangerous substances. And the truth is they may have taken a Kratom product that was adulterated. And in any of those things, or they could have taken Kratom along with other substances the other substances caused the death, or the person could have an underlying health condition. But there has been no scientific evidence that Kratom causes a death. And until we get that, until we see that, then I don't think that anyone should concede the argument that Kratom is deadly. Now, none of us can say you can't overdose on Kratom. There are tragic cases around the country every day of kids overdosing on 5-hour energy drinks. Unfortunately, people can overdose on water because if you drink too much water, it upsets your electrolyte balance and causes respiratory arrest. These are hard problems, but I can tell you that we have got to defend our turf. We've got to stand up and speak out respectfully to those who have lost loved ones, understand that they are in pain, that they want to strike out and find a reasonable expectation. And I'm not saying that they're not sincere. They are, but they're being misled by a group of shark attorneys. I can tell you that, and they're empowering them and they're organizing them, and it's a way for them to channel that grief that they're having. And I respect that, but I don't respect the manipulation of information and denying those families the right to know the truth. And I think that's what all of us want. And we're ready to stand by the science. Whatever the outcomes are of this scientific research, they should be as well. So I would leave you just with the appeal. You've heard it already. Let's get organized. Let's add to our numbers. Let's push hard to make sure whatever sacrifices are required, that we show up at these hearings and raise our voices so that the truth can prevail in these policy bodies where we're making these cases to protect access to kratom for every consumer that uses it for harm reduction, and for those that just use it for the morning pick-me-up and increased focus as an alternative to caffeine in coffee. We should have the freedom and the right to do so.
Great. Well, thank you, Mac. And thank you all for joining us. We will be in touch soon again with more updates, and be in touch with you directly for anything that may happen in your local area or state level. My email is Ryan, R-Y-A-N, @americankratom.org. If we did not answer your questions, please contact me directly. But thank you all very much. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.